Edward Sterck is the Director of Research at the World Platinum Investment Council, and he is here to give us not only the outlook for demand of platinum, but also the investment case for platinum, all the way from electric cars to its usage in a future hydrogen economy. Very interesting topic. Edward, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, David. It's a pleasure to join you.
Pleasure to have you. Now, your annual or quarterly report came out not too long ago, and I'm just going to start by asking you to summarize for us the investment case for platinum right now.
Yeah, so we think the investment case for platinum is looking pretty interesting. We're coming out of a period where we've had 2 years of fairly significant surpluses. And for 2023, we're projecting the platinum market to enter into a deficit of around 303,000 ounces. Now, that deficit of 303,000 ounces compares to a total market that's around 7.5 million ounces in size. So we are heading towards a meaningful deficit emerging in 2023. We have some separate projections that we run beyond 2023, and the outlook is generally for the platinum market deficits to continue into the foreseeable future. Now, there are a couple of underlying drivers behind those deficits. On the supply side, we are seeing a somewhat constrained supply outlook, both in terms of mine supply and also in terms of recycling. For mine supply, it's a product really of ongoing challenges in terms of power availability in South Africa. South Africa accounts for 75% of global platinum production. And then we also see some risks. We don't factor this into our forecast just yet, but we do see some risks to the downside in terms of supply coming from Russia. That's around 10% of global platinum supply. And that's purely as a result of a combination of sanctions, making it more challenging for Raw Nickel, which is the Russian mining company producing platinum and palladium, to be able to gain access to mining equipment and also spares. And it's also just the worsening economic situation there. So the supply outlook is somewhat constrained. On the demand side, we are seeing a fair bit of demand growth, and that's mainly from the automotive sector. And it's largely a result of platinum for palladium substitution in gasoline and diesel catalytic converters. So effectively, you can substitute platinum for palladium on a one-to-one basis, and with palladium trading at a significant premium to platinum at the moment, that's incentivizing the automakers to make that substitution. It improves the economics for the vehicles that they're selling. And the substitution rates and the impact on demand are sufficient to more than offset any challenges in terms of automotive production numbers, particularly in Europe. So it's a constrained supply, and we are seeing demand growth, and that's well protected even in what could be a fairly challenging economic outlook at the moment.
I'm looking at the price of platinum. It's trading at around, as we speak today, $1,046 US per troy ounce. Now, if you take a look at the long-term chart of platinum, over the last 10 years or so, it's had a steady decline over the first half of the 2010s and then kind of a consolidation period. But more or less, it's been down for the last 10 years. Why do you think that the price of platinum has been more or less weak, if I may use that term, for the better part of the last decade?
Well, I mean, we certainly think that it's underpriced versus gold and versus palladium, but the real reason for the platinum price performance being so muted over the last 10 years is largely as a result of palladium substitution for platinum in automotive catalytic converters. So in the past, when palladium was trading at a significant discount to platinum, we saw the automakers try to substitute platinum out and put palladium in, and capture the economic benefit of doing that. They went through that process through the first half of the 2010s. You then had Dieselgate in Europe and in North America, where some of the automakers were demonstrated to be trying to cheat the emissions control legislation and tests. And so effectively that put quite a significant amount of pressure on the diesel market in particular. And we saw consumer preference in Europe, which had been a really important market for light passenger vehicles with diesel engines, switching towards gasoline engines, which had a greater bearing in terms of demand for palladium. Platinum is used more exclusively in diesel vehicles historically. And so those two factors in the automotive industry had a fairly significant negative bearing on platinum demand for the automotive sector, and that's ultimately what ended up weighing on prices. What we're seeing at the moment is that entire trend is reversing in favor of platinum now, and that's one of the reasons that we think the outlook for platinum could be quite interesting at this point in time.
Okay, let's touch on that. So you're right. The palladium price has been, I wouldn't say inversely correlated, but it's had a very good run over the last 10 years, perhaps precisely for the reasons you just mentioned. Now, Edward, tell us about what you just said, expand a bit more, why the tides are shifting in platinum's favor. Are industries finding a new use case for platinum now that perhaps over the last 10 years they haven't discovered, or what's the reason here?
So you've got, as I talked about, the substitution in the automotive space that's favouring platinum at the moment. We've also got pretty strong demand coming from.
Sorry, just so I understand correctly, you said that it was used in the platinum was used in the auto industry, and then it became substituted by palladium. Is it being substituted back?
Correct, because palladium is trading at such a significant premium to platinum. We're seeing that trend reverse. So platinum is being substituted for palladium in both gasoline and diesel vehicles, and that's really what's driving automotive demand growth for platinum.
Can you explain in layman terms the actual use cases for platinum and palladium in a car? I presume they're interchangeable commodities if they're being substituted for one another, and it's just a matter of price. But maybe there's a technical difference here.
They do have slightly different properties. So they're used in the exhaust systems to reduce harmful emissions. They basically act as catalyzers to convert harmful emissions into less harmful emissions. And they can, to a large degree, be mutually substituted for each other. Palladium has slightly better thermal stability. So in some parts of the exhaust system that are closer to the engine, it's quite hard to substitute that palladium out for platinum. But overall, our estimates are that you can substitute about 75% of the palladium out of a gasoline exhaust system for platinum. So I mean, we're a long way away from that 75% substitution being realised. But there are, apart from the hotter parts of the exhaust system, there are no technical hurdles these days to substituting platinum for palladium.
Do newer cars these days require a certain exhaust system that necessitate either palladium or platinum?
So every auto manufacturer, when producing a vehicle with an internal combustion engine, it has to meet the regulatory requirements in the geography in which they're selling that vehicle. In terms of the emissions that those vehicles produce. At the moment, using platinum group metals, so platinum or palladium and some rhodium, in those exhaust systems is really the most surefire way to be able to meet the emissions regulation targets. Mm-hmm. So as things are going forwards, we're seeing a continued tightening of emission standards. And that's also another driving factor behind projection of growing automotive demand for platinum. So in Europe, for example, in around 2027, the date's not quite set, we'll be seeing the emissions regulations moving to the Euro 7 standards from Euro 6 today, and that's highly likely to result in automakers having to use more PGMs in order to ensure that they meet those tighter emission standards.
So what price does palladium need to fall down to before the industry becomes interested in using it again? You mentioned it's too expensive now.
Yeah, so look, I mean, I think it's more. We actually expect it to be more a question of platinum moving towards palladium than the other way around.
Okay.
There is a bit of a sort of consensus view amongst investors that palladium market's going to be moving into big surpluses. It's not going to be that interesting from from an investment perspective. But one of the interesting things for platinum that will potentially have a bearing on palladium demand in the future is that it has an emergent new source of end demand, which is hydrogen. So platinum is used in the electrolyzers for the production of green hydrogen. That's where you take renewable energy, you use it to effectively separate water into oxygen and to hydrogen. That hydrogen it can then be used as a fuel to displace natural gas, or it can be used in a fuel cell in order to generate electricity. One of those end uses is as fuel cells in vehicles, so particularly for heavy-duty vehicles, in order to displace, reduce emissions and kind of electrify the heavy-duty vehicle segment, using fuel cells instead of an internal combustion engine to generate electricity and drive that vehicle along is quite a significant source of future end demand for platinum. And we're expecting that to grow through the course of the 2020s and into the 2030s, and for that to be a big driver of platinum demand going forward. Now, one of the sort of knock-on effects of that is that ultimately, in order to supply the hydrogen economy with enough platinum to meet future projections, we'll probably have to start seeing palladium being substituted back for platinum in internal combustion engines to ensure that there's adequate supply available for the hydrogen economy.
When you talk about the hydrogen economy, it's not just cars, right? Can you give us an overview of what that economy entails?
Yeah, so there's multiple end uses for hydrogen. Today, most hydrogen is produced using natural gas, so effectively cracking natural gas, releasing CO2, but producing hydrogen. Obviously, that's a fairly significant source of CO2 emissions, and it's an area that there's a lot of work going into to try and abate those emissions. One of the possibilities there is the PEM electrolyzers that I just mentioned. You use renewable power to run those PEM electrolyzers that take water in and then split it into oxygen and hydrogen, release the oxygen unless you can find an industrial end use for that. And then the hydrogen is stored and used as a fuel. You can blend in up to around 20% hydrogen into existing natural gas networks without any change to the infrastructure. And obviously that helps reduce CO2 emissions from burning natural gas in industrial facilities and to produce heat in people's homes. And then ultimately, of course, you can use it in other end uses as well. So for the production of fertilizers or for, as I said, in fuel cells to generate electricity.
Okay, interesting. And the advantages of a hydrogen economy versus traditional electricity generation, what are they?
Well, principally lower emissions, and you also have you're generating, if you're using a fuel cell, you're generating electricity directly. The only emissions from that is actually water. So in a fuel cell, you're taking that green hydrogen, you're combining it with oxygen from the atmosphere, and all that results in is H2O, is water. So if you look at some of the fuel cell electric vehicles, they don't have an exhaust pipe in the same way that an internal combustion vehicle has, but they do have a pipe out of which water gradually trickles, basically. So that's the only emissions that you get from a fuel cell electric vehicle.
Is this energy efficient? I mean, it sounds like it needs to consume more energy than it needs to. Well, not perhaps more, but consume a lot of energy in order to generate electricity.
Yeah, the energy efficiency is about 50%. So if you compare that to, say, a battery electric vehicle, that energy efficiency is a little bit lower than for a battery electric vehicle. But one of the main advantages is that you can refuel a vehicle very quickly. So rather than plugging in a battery electric vehicle and charging it up, which can take potentially several hours, and
Yes.
These problems become more significant when you're talking about larger vehicle categories. So if we're talking about long distance trucking, if you're having to stop every few hours to then charge for a number of hours, moving produce around, it becomes more and more challenging. So your capacity utilization of a large articulated lorry, for example, if you're using batteries to power that vehicle, is significantly lower than it would be today using internal combustion engines. And what fuel cells allow is to solve that problem. You can go to a hydrogen refueling station, refuel the vehicle in just the same way as you do today with a petrol, a gasoline or a diesel vehicle, and maintain those high capacity utilization rates.
Well, let's talk about electric vehicles now. One of the existential threats that I've gotten for the PGMs is that because we are shifting towards an electrified economy with more EVs on the road, we don't need cars with combustion engines that necessitate catalytic converters, and thus the demand for PGMs would be lower in the future. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, so look, I mean, I think that's the electrification trend is obviously a really important feature of the automotive industry at the moment. ultimately, it's incredibly important as the world looks to try and reduce its overall emissions. That said, we think that the demise of the internal combustion engine is likely to be much more longer in terms of have a much longer time frame than some people think it is today. So if we look at the pace of electrification of the automotive industry, it's really been dominated to a large extent by Europe and China in terms of uptake of electric vehicles. A lot of the people who are taking up those electric vehicles, though, probably have two vehicles in their household, and the other one will be an internal combustion engine vehicle, because range anxiety for longer distance journeys just means that electric vehicles are a lot more challenging to use. The infrastructure isn't quite there yet in certain parts of the world. And as already discussed, for some vehicle categories, particularly the larger ones, battery electrification is just not necessarily the best technological solution. So it's also a question of geography as well. In some geographies, if you're in, I don't know, for example, the middle of Africa, being able to charge a Tesla isn't necessarily always easy. So our outlook is for internal combustion engine demand to bounce back a little bit from the internal combustion manufacturing to bounce back a bit from the challenges we've seen through COVID and then through the semiconductor and other supply chain issues over the last few years, and ultimately to peak in around 2027, and then to decline thereafter. But that decline is quite a long and drawn out process because of those geographies and vehicle activities that are hard to electrify.
Well, the technical infrastructure limitations you mentioned are very real. You're absolutely right. But we haven't yet talked about legislation. All around the world, governments are regulating the industry a little bit more, and they're setting deadlines for how long the industry can sell combustion engine cars. Even, where you live, the UK, I believe the UK has set 2030 to be the deadline after which it is forbidden to sell cars with combustion engines. Do you think this is going to get pushed back, or do you think this will be met?
I think it's pretty likely to be pushed back, to be honest with you. Yes, we've got to ultimately move away from them altogether, but I'm just not sure that the automotive industry is able to deliver battery electric vehicles in the volumes that would be needed by 2030, for example, in the UK, or 2035 in Europe. There are certainly some potential limitations in terms of the availability of the raw materials that go into the batteries in those vehicles, and at the same time, they're substantially more expensive than the internal combustion engine equivalent. So effectively, by forcing consumers to move towards those battery electric vehicles, ultimately governments are going to be penalising some of the lower income people in society. And I think as we get closer towards that date, that sort of economic unfairness is probably going to have a bigger part to play in terms of the decisions that are made around whether those dates are going to be set in stone or not.
Right. There's been a lot of chatter on the internet and social media, not just recently, but over the last few years, about the actual environmental impact of using an electric vehicle. Some argue that it's not actually more clean than a gas-powered car, precisely because the metals required in the batteries and other components of the car require more intensive mining, which in itself pollutes the environment. How would you respond?
Yeah, look, I think that is those are valid points to raise, really. Ultimately, there has to be better infrastructure put in place for recycling those batteries and ensuring that the materials within them are being reused. And also it depends upon, in terms of the vehicle itself and the period it's being used for, it depends on the geography. So if you're charging a Tesla in say, a country where most of the power generation is still coming from coal, effectively all you're doing is moving those emissions from the tailpipe to the chimney stack at the power station. So I think a lot of those problems will be gradually resolved with time, and certainly we're seeing significant increases in renewable power generation around the world that makes the equation move slightly more in favour towards electric vehicles than internal combustion engines. But there are still a lot of challenges facing the industry in terms of actually really having genuine green credentials. And one of the advantages fuel cells have, and the catalytic converter systems in internal combustion engines, where platinum is contained, they are eminently recyclable. We've already got all of the recycling supply chains, logistics in place to be able to do that.
Okay, and you mentioned that the platinum market will likely see a deficit. You've talked about the supply side of the equation. I'm curious to understand a little bit more about the demand. We are entering, where some economists say that we potentially could be entering a recession. Certainly, we've seen an economic slowdown. We've seen that in the sales of cars. They've gone down, especially in the EV market. Given that we are having more EVs per cars, so the EV market share penetration is growing, but do you think we'll have enough demand from the auto manufacturers overall, given that we are seeing an economic recession or potentially a recession, to drive up the price of palladium and platinum?
Yeah, so I think it's a really valid question to ask. Clearly, the world's economy is looking a little bit shaky over the next year or two. And we are seeing rising interest rates as well, which obviously make buying new vehicles relatively more expensive if buying them on credit. I think that there are some sort of factors that would provide tailwinds in the opposite direction. So we saw significant challenges facing automotive production in 2021 and in the first part of this year. Those were driven primarily by supply chain issues. So the most well-publicized one being, of course, the semiconductor shortage that came about as a result of COVID. The knock-on effect of that, of course, is that people have been forced, therefore, if they haven't been able to buy a new vehicle, they've been forced to run their existing vehicles for longer. I think that a lot of those vehicles are very much reaching the end of their lives, and consumers may just have no choice but to go and try and replace them. Certainly the case for the large fleet operators. As a result, although we've got economically challenging times, I think the outlook for the automotive industry in terms of consumer demand, it should be relatively robust with that pent-up demand coming through over the next couple of years. But ultimately, the bigger factor there is that substitution of platinum for palladium that we've already spoken to. So even if automotive production numbers are somewhat capped by the economic realities facing us in the future, that substitution process is going to continue, and it does continue to drive growth even in a recessionary environment. On the other side, of the demand equation, industrial demand is relatively well protected as well. So industrial demand is tend to be dominated by capacity additions. We've got a number of capacity additions in the glass sector coming through in 2023, and those are pretty much already locked in terms of the commitments, and to a large extent in terms of constructing those facilities, they're already substantially completed by now. So we think industrial demand, at least in the near term, is pretty well protected too. The one area where I think the global economy in the near term could have more of a negative bearing would be on jewelry demand. So people are getting hit in terms of their real incomes. Obviously, they're less likely to go out and buy platinum jewelry, but that's now only around 25% of the overall demand picture. So it has less of a bearing than automotive and industrial demand.
Very good. And finally, let's talk about the price. So you mentioned that it's more likely for platinum to reach palladium's level than the other way around. Right now, platinum's trading around $10.48 an ounce. Palladium's at around $1,600, $1,654. So that's about a 60% upside for platinum. Does that sound about right?
We don't give hard and fast sort of forecasts for platinum price,
right,
for various reasons. But I'd say that we certainly think there's a good chance that if we are entering a sustained deficit in the platinum market, in any commodity where you have a sustained deficit, you'll typically see a positive price response as a result.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's suppose thrifting were out of the equation. Suppose that the industry doesn't need to thrift in the sense that platinum and palladium are trading at the exact same price. Which do you think would be more coveted, I would say, by the automotive industry?
Oh, look, I mean, I think it kind of depends on what's going on with everything else. So,
okay,
if the hydrogen economy is really taking off, I think the automotive industry would clearly be cognizant of that, and that would probably play into how they would plan their procurement of the relative amounts of platinum and palladium in the future. But it takes a long time to change that process. So when a new vehicle is being developed, you can play around with the ratio of platinum, palladium, rhodium, on a fluid basis up until the point where you go through certification. And once that vehicle's certified, those ratios are pretty much locked in for the lifetime of that vehicle platform, which is usually around 7 years. So automakers typically don't go back, change things, and try to recertify the vehicle because the expense to them is just too great. So once substitution occurs, it's locked in for an extended period of time.
All right, fantastic. Edward, thank you for your analysis. Thank you for educating us on platinum, and appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you, David.
And thank you for watching the show. I'm David Lin. Stay tuned for more, and don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel.